animal science classes. It's Miss Chaudry here with your first set of notes for last unit together. This unit is going to focus on animal health, looking at how we examine spread of disease, how we minimize spread of disease, different types of pathogens, a little bit about how we treat, with the goal of kind of bringing everything together with a focus on animal health and animal wellness, and kind of bringing a lot of these concepts together that we've been talking about throughout the whole year. The goal in any production facility, any pet owner, etc., is always to have the happiest, healthiest animals possible. That's going to impact their quality of life. It's going to impact their attitude, your relationship with them. And from a producer standpoint, that's going to affect and make sure that you have a really good quality product, whether that product is work or milk or meat or fur or whatever the case may be. So focusing on health is really important. So let's get started. Our objectives are going to be to identify ways of preventing diseases, symptoms, prevention, treatment of animals, a little bit on how to diagnose diseases. We're going to do less of that, obviously, because it's hard for us to not have some of those interactions not being in the classroom. But you are going to show your understanding of this towards the end of the unit by looking at a disease and kind of bringing all these pieces together. Not unlike what we did for your nutritional disease. Okay? That idea that health and health problems really bring all of these concepts and the importance of these concepts together. So let's keep going. First of all, a disease is classified or considered any kind of disorder or incorrect function of an organ or a structure or a system within an animal's body. Okay, disease is kind of a really general term that we use to describe a whole boatload of different problems that can affect an animal being healthy, being well, being active. In our last unit, you guys looked specifically at what we call nutritional disorders, which are any sort of health problem that's related to what an animal is getting in their diet, or more likely, what an animal's not getting in their diet. Okay, so diseases include that, but they also include a whole bunch of other things. Okay, anytime something's going wrong within the body, we can usually link that to some kind of health problem, some kind of disease. So, in order for disease to exist, at least transmissible diseases, there are three things that need to occur. Okay, we need to have a pathogen. A pathogen is a disease causing agent. It's something that's going to make the animal sick. We have to have a susceptible host, aka an animal that's capable of getting this pathogen and becoming ill due to its influence. And then we also have to have an environment in which the pathogen is able to live and multiply and thus come in contact with the host. Okay? If we don't have these things, we don't have some diseases, what we call transmissible diseases, those that can be passed from one organism to the next. There are certainly some diseases, which we'll talk about in our next lesson, that don't require a favorable environment and they don't require a pathogen because they actually live inside the host or they're due to some kind of actions of the host. Nutritional diseases don't follow this disease triangle because there's no pathogen. It's just the host is or is not eating what they're supposed to be eating, and the environment is the host's own body. Okay, so disease can be, I should say, infectious diseases or transmittable diseases are those that can move from an infected animal to another susceptible animal through a multitude of different methods. Okay, we have direct contact, indirect contact, droplet contact, airborne transmission, fecal oral transmission, and vector borne transmission. We're going to be focusing mostly in this unit on infectious diseases, okay? Because as producers or as owners of animals, these are the ones that we can do the most to kind of mitigate against. Okay, we can put in protections, we can provide medications, treatments to stop the spread of these. Genetic diseases, we have some control over because obviously we're trying to maximize genetics in our herd or within our pets. And so we have some control over that. But if an animal has a genetic disease, all we can really do at that point is hopefully mitigate their symptoms. We can't like go back and change their genes after the fact. And nutritional diseases we already talked about, right? We fix those based on diets. There are certainly medications we can give when that gets severe, but most of the time just feeding a good diet is what's going to prevent that. So in this unit, we really want to focus on the other classification of disease, which are the transmittable or infectious diseases. So today's notes are really going to focus on these types of contact. So looking at the ways that these diseases then get transmitted. Direct contact is the first, it's the most obvious because you have an animal that is sick and they come in contact with another animal that is sick in some way. Okay? That can be just by touching, proximity. This one is certainly a concern more for production animals, maybe than pets, because production animals usually you have multiple within a farm, within a pasture, within a building like a barn. And so, if one animal gets sick and we don't notice it very quickly, it's really easy for that to spread because they're coming in contact with one another. This is also a reason that animals in like humane societies and shelters are more likely to get certain health issues. Those of you who have ever adopted dogs, one of the things they screen for is something called parvovirus. Okay, it's very easily spread through, amongst other things, contact with infected animals, and so they have to be really careful about that because there's lots of animals in a pretty small space. It's really easy for them to spread health problems. Direct contact also includes sexual contact. So there is a host of diseases that can be passed when animals are breeding, and also in some cases when they're giving birth. Contact with oral secretions. Rabies is an example of a disease that spreads through direct contact and oral secretions. One of the telltale signs or traditional signs of rabies is foaming at the mouth. Um, that saliva, okay, not just the foam, but any saliva, is one of the easy ways that rabies gets passed, like an infected animal bites or just licks another animal, and they can get that pathogen. Contact with body lesions is also a form of direct contact. So if an animal has an open sore and another animal comes in contact with it, pigs, which are pictured here, can do that pretty easily because pigs like to gnaw on each other when they're in the same pen area. So it's really easy for them to come in contact with an injury on that animal that was caused by another pig, and they can get sick from that. So those are going to be examples of direct contact. Like literally, those animals touch parts of one another, they get sick from coming in contact with that. Indirect contact happens when one animal touches a surface and then leaves their, we'll call them germs, but whatever their pathogen is behind. And then another animal comes in contact with that same surface and then they get sick. This is why sometimes you'll notice during the school year, Miss Chaudhry is very like crazy and very like die hard about washing surfaces off. When we do like any of our dissection labs, things like that, we always want to make sure that we're cleaning things really well. Um, but with animals, that often happens usually through feed bowls, water bowls, because they're coming in contact with those same things. Fencing, stalls, any tack. If you're working with horses that an animal's coming in contact with, that's why, especially right now, as we're looking at the spread of coronavirus, one of the things in the horse world that has been put up is making sure that you're not sharing tack with other people, because although your animal might not get that, if you are sharing that equipment, you could be spreading like pathogens, disease. Okay. And that's the same thing with animals. Okay. So just being aware of what surfaces they've come in contact with um, can really help minimize the spread of disease. Okay. Droplet contact is any time that an animal comes in contact with microorganisms in the eyes, nose, and mouth. And this is why I always remind students, cover your mouth. When you're sneezing or coughing, the same thing happens with animals. Okay, one of them coughs or sneezes, the droplets from their eyes or their mouth or their nose, mostly their nose or their mouth, coughing or sneezing out your eyes would be a bit weird. But those particles get in the air and they can hang in the air for a little bit. And if another animal comes in contact, either because they're close to each other as that animal's coughing or they walk by shortly after, they can pick up those pathogens. Airborne transmission is pretty similar. It happens mostly due to the same thing, but this happens when those droplets start to evaporate or dust particles hanging in the air contain microorganisms. And so animals will breathe those in, or it might settle onto feed and then they eat that feed and it gets into their body, gets into their respiratory tract as they're breathing, and then they can get sick again from that. Fecal oral transmission. This is one that really causes a lot of issues, but we tend to overlook how easy it is for animals to get this. Basically, fecal oral transmission happens anytime a pathogen gets in the body through contaminated food or water. Okay, when you hear fecal oral transmission, you think, well, who's going around eating feces? Okay, well, those of you who have dogs know that that happens sometimes. Okay, I've certainly had dogs as a kid who liked to eat their poop or cat poop. But it's not just about going and eating just fecal material. Fecal oral transmission happens most of the time when an animal's food or water comes in contact with fecal material. Okay, think about in our picture. Okay, we've got some horses grazing in a pasture. Well, if a horse has defecated in that pasture and they had their fecal material there, okay, and another horse maybe walks through it, gets some on their hooves, they're walking around through that pasture, okay, brushing against some of the grass that they're consuming, and then another horse comes up and eats that grass. Anything that was in that feces could have been on that hoof, could have gotten in that grass, and now is getting eaten. Okay, this also really happens very easily in water because it's really easy for water to get contaminated, for it to sit stagnant, and then another animal to come up and drink that water that has now these tiny little microorganisms that are going to make them sick. Vector-borne transmission is the last major category. Vector-borne transmission occurs when vectors, which are animals or insects, transfer the disease to another animal. Typically speaking, vector species carry the disease, but they don't get sick themselves. So, for example, malaria is a vector borne disease. Okay, mosquitoes carry malaria. Okay, they don't get sick from it, but when they bite someone, okay, then they inject the malaria pathogen into that person's body, and then that person gets sick. Okay, ticks, flies, mites, lots of insects. Okay, carry lots of diseases inside them. They don't get sick, but the second they bite another animal, they can transfer that disease. Often it's a bacteria into that animal they bit. Now that animal gets sick. That's how Lyme's disease gets transmitted. Um, Rats can also spread disease through their feces because, again, they act as a vector. They carry the disease, they don't get sick, but then they leave their fecal material different places. And that sometimes accidentally gets mixed in with like animal feed, things like that. And then the animal consumes whatever was in that fecal material. And thus, again, they get sick. This is actually how like the plague spread was fleas actually on rats. And then as rats were in people's homes, etc., the fleas would come off of them, the people would get bit by the fleas, and then they would get the bubonic plague. So super common actual method of transmission. We see it a lot. We know lots of diseases that are caused by it, but one we don't tend to think about because it's not as simple as the whole like, well, don't cough on me. Okay. And again, I'm referencing me because it's really easy for me to think about that. But all of this is really about animals and how animals get sick. There's lots of diseases. West Nile is a disease that is transmitted by mosquitoes, super common in people, but also in horses. And they get sick because they get bit by infected mosquitoes. Heartworm. Those of you who have dogs know that heartworm medication is one of the recommended medicines anywhere that mosquitoes are prevalent because mosquitoes will carry the little worm larva inside their bodies. They bite your dog, they inject that larva into your dog, and over time, those larvae multiply, and then you get these long, basically worms that lodge in the cardiac tissue of your animal and could eventually cause basically a massive heart attack because there's so many worms inside the heart that it blocks blood flow, which is disgusting. And I apologize for those of you who are squeamish, but talk about some gross things in this unit. Okay. The last thing we want to talk about then are what are called zoonotic diseases. And zoonotic diseases are a class of disease. Okay, they're all sorts of different kinds. They're caused by all sorts of different things, but basically they're any disease that can get passed between animals and people. Okay, this can be viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungi. But animals can give them to people, and or people can give them to animals. Usually that happens by coming in contact with body fluids. or being bit by a vector, drinking unsafe water, or eating food. But sometimes it is literally just in like skin to skin contact. Really good example of that is ringworm. Ringworm is a fungal infection. It's not actually like a parasite or a worm. It's a fungus that animals can get from one another and that humans can very easily get from animals, literally just by touching wherever they have that ringworm. Okay. So, last thing we want to talk about in this section of notes is what increases the likelihood of transmission occurring. Okay, we've looked at different ways that diseases get transmitted. Okay, it's really easy to know those and to try to avoid those, but there are certainly some conditions that make it harder to avoid the spread of disease. And these can happen both in homes, in production facilities, and also with animals in the wild. So the major factors that are going to increase the likelihood of disease transmission are number one, poor environment. Okay, if an animal is living in an area that's unsanitary or it's super crowded or there's not a lot of good airflow, it makes it really easy for them to come in contact with other animals, their fecal material, their airborne particles, and get sick. The picture we have here is a picture of a home where someone had a unhealthy amount of animals present in their home. You can see there's, oh my gosh, I think at least 15 different chihuahuas in this picture. And because of that, when these animals were rescued by authorities, a lot of them had some health problems because the more animals you have sharing a space, the easier it is for them to A, get sick, and then B, spread that sickness. Okay, so environment is a big one. Next is temperature and moisture levels. Bacteria, fungus, parasites, etc., all like areas that are warm and moist. And so any area that's hotter and any area that has more moisture, whether that's naturally in the outdoors or whether that's inside a facility, are going to make it more likely for animals to get sick because it's a better environment for the things that make them sick to live in. Stress is one that's going to make it not easier for the disease itself to transmit, but easier for the animal's immune system or their body to not be able to fight it off. Okay, the more stress an animal is placed under, environmental stress, nutritional stress, etc., the easier it is for their body to get overwhelmed by a pathogen and for them to get sick. Okay. Poor nutrition kind of ties into that. Obviously, poor nutrition can cause stress because the body's not getting enough calories to go through all of its natural processes. But we also know that poor nutrition can affect the immune system, especially a lack of vitamins and minerals, which again makes it easier for that animal to fall victim to any health issues. The last one then is presence of vectors. Okay, especially if you're talking about a vector-borne illness, it's more likely for them to get it if there's more vectors there. Okay, most people, most animals don't get sick from things like heartworm or West Nile virus, were my two examples earlier, during the winter. Okay, we don't see a ton of animals get Lyme's disease or get diagnosed with Lyme's disease in the winter because there's no ticks or there's no mosquitoes. So if you don't have those vectors, or if you luckily live in a place that doesn't have them at all, we are not so lucky in Wisconsin. But if you don't have those vectors, you don't typically get those diseases because there's nothing to give them to you. Okay. So all of these different things are going to increase the likelihood that animals get any of the diseases we've talked about. So this is just an introduction to kind of how disease spreads. Your next lesson is going to look at some of the different classifications of pathogens and the different ways, different causes, I should say, of disease. And then at the end of this week, you're going to be doing a lab on what's called a gizmo, which is going to look at some different kinds of diseases and how they get transmitted between organisms. It's going to be people in your lab. The same concepts apply to animals. It's just that there's not a lot of good labs out there that you guys can do at home that are not human health focused, but the same concepts apply. Okay. So if you have questions, let myself or Ms. Strupp know. Otherwise, good luck, and we will see you with your next lesson later. Take care, guys. We miss you.